Joyce and concern is like, why don't we just mute that one for now? Because I don't think everyone's getting used to it.
That's probably the one that Camila will use, and she's song lady.
Who will you, Carmela will use?
When song lady.
Okay.
Right now.
The which one?
The lecture.
Good morning. Happy New Year. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Fredericksburg. We are situated on the ancestral homeland of the Rappahannock and Patawomic tribes, and where enslaved people were forced to work on the land. We acknowledge that this land holds many histories, great stories, and the blood of a people. Thank you, Madison. Good morning. I am Carmela Southers, she, her, and I will be your worship associate this morning. If you're joining us as a guest or a first-time visitor, we're glad you're here. You're invited to leave your contact information at the welcome table in the foyer. We look forward to getting to know you. Good morning. Everyone is invited to fill out a card about a personal, significant joy or concern that you would like shared during the service. You may pick up and leave your card at the Joys and Concerns table in that back corner. Our pastoral care team member will collect the cards and read them later in the service. Here at the UUFF, we strive to nurture learning, inspire spiritual insights, create compassionate relationships, and lovingly transform our community and the world. Please join us after the service for coffee and conversation. I invite us now all to greet one another. People online, if you've muted your audio or video, please take a moment now to unmute so that we can all greet one another face to face. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yes, Bonnie's there. Hi, Bonnie. I think she heard me.
All right. Great. So it's so good to have you with us today. Please join me in reading our chalice lighting words. Found on the screen. There we go. There were a time for a candle in the darkness. This would be it. Using a spark of hope, kindle the flame of love, ignite the light of peace, and feed the flame of justice. Chris.
New Year? Yeah, so I'm Chris Johns, the Director of Lifespan Religious Education. First time using this kind of mic here. And I would like to invite the children who are willing to come forward and hang out with me. I have a little story that I'm going to read. Hello, Elliot. And we have a new face here. We have Margaret. And oh, did you want to come, Amani? Oh my goodness, I haven't seen this little face since she was about this tall. Hey, friends. Hey, friends. Okay, so the theme for the month is finding our center. So when I was thinking about that, it reminded me of an old commercial, but I'm going to have to ask somebody to find what's in the Wonder Box. Oh. And we do have, well, you can all, there's 3 things in there, so come on up. And I promise you the things that you're going to want to hang on to, we have more of. Oh, what did Elliot find? What is that? Can you turn and show everybody? Oh, a Tootsie Pop and a book. Thank you.
And another Tootsie Pop.
And another Tootsie Pop. So what I want to say is, there are lots of Tootsie Pops in the classroom. So everyone will get a Tootsie Pop, okay? Don't want you to feel deprived. But yeah, so have a seat on the carpet. No, you can hang on to it if you want, but let's not eat them right now. That's it, Margaret, but thank you for coming to help me. Thank you. All right, so why would there be Tootsie Pops in the Wonder Box when we are talking about finding our center?
Because they have a little bit of gum in the center.
Well, they don't have gum, but they do have something. And this is something the 4 of you might not remember, but there used to be a commercial for Tootsie Pops. I'm seeing some recognition, like little smiles. There was a commercial, and I happen to have one more here. Phew, magical. I know, right? Magic pocket. So back in the day, there was a commercial, And there was a little boy, it is a cartoon. Little boy went to a tree, and there was this wise old owl with big glasses sitting in the tree. And the little boy said to the owl, "How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop?" And the owl took the Tootsie Pop and went, 1, 2, 3, and then he bit it. And he said, 3, right? So does it take more licks to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? Yes, it totally does. But, so the owl kind of cheated, right? So he bit. He tried to take the easy way to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop. And so what I'm thinking about today is when we think about finding our center, it is not that easy, right? We can't just take the easy path to finding our center. And that's when I think about finding my center, what do you think about? Finding my center, what do you think about? Do you think about just the center of your body, or do you think more about like the center of who you are? What do you think about? Yes, I think more about, and so does Lillian. And Lillian and Elliot, I will tell you, everybody, that they have moved to Pennsylvania, but they're here visiting us today, so I'm super excited. So when we think about finding our center, we think about finding out who we really are. So it takes more than 3 licks to find our center. And once we get there, like Elliot said, there's some gum in here. And we know there's not gum in here, but there's just one thing in the middle of this Tootsie Pop. Just one thing, right? But when we find our own center, we're going to find that there's a lot of stuff in there. And some is good, and some is not so good. But it's worth the journey, and it's worth looking for. So I'm going to read to you, and I will try to, I don't know what you can see. Hi, me. Okay. There I am. There you are. There's everybody. So this book is called I Am Human, and it's written by Susan Verde, and the pictures are by Peter H. Reynolds. And I want to read you who she dedicated this to, because I love it. It says, "To Diana G. for her creative soul and inspiration shared over dinner, and to my fellow humans," that's us, "keep learning, forgiving, and loving one another." Yeah, so here we go. So this book, it kind of reminds me of this little guy finding his center. So he says, "I was born a miracle, one of billions, but unique." And there's a little tiny baby. I don't know. No, you can't see it all. Okay. "I am human, and I am always learning." You guys can see, right? Yeah, okay, good. Because it's getting a little shiny over there. "I'm finding my way and choosing my path on this incredible journey. I have big dreams. I see possibility." Oh, do you see yourself, Margaret? You see your hands. Yep. "I have endless curiosity." I know, I bet there's a lot of endless curiosity in this crew. Yes, ma'am, I see you. "I make discoveries. I have a feeling of wonder. I am amazed by nature. I have a playful side, look. And I find joy in friendships. I am human." So those are a lot of good things, right? But being human means I am not perfect. I make mistakes. Does anybody here make mistakes sometimes? Hey, let's see some hands back there. Come on, I know the truth. "I can hurt others with my words, my actions, and even my silence. I can be hurt too. I can be fearful of things I do not yet understand and timid to try something new." So there's this, he's thinking about climbing this big ladder, and he climbs it and he goes out to the edge of a diving board. I probably would not enjoy doing that. "I have a heavy heart when I feel sadness, but then I remind myself that because I am human, I can make choices." What is he going to do? He's going to jump. He's going to soar. "I can move forward." And look, here he comes down, and he's running, and he's running, and he finds a flower. What does he do to that flower? He picks it up. And what does he do to it? Yes, he smells it. A poor choice can become a better choice with thoughtfulness. A bad day can become a great day with kindness. So look, he picked the flower, but then what did he do with it?
Gives it to his friend.
He gave it to his friend. You're so smart. "I can act with compassion and lend a helping hand." See, he's helping this lady. "I can treat others with equality and be fair." And that is something we are all working really, really hard on, right? I can choose not to fight, but instead to listen and find common ground. And I can say, I'm sorry, and ask for forgiveness, which we all need to do sometimes. I am human, one of billions, but unique. I am not alone. I am connected to my friends, to my family, to the world. We are all humans together. See all the humans? Yeah.
But they're all different.
And they're all different colors, yes. All the humans are different colors. They have different color hair and skin and eyes. And they have different thoughts, and some are tall and some are not so tall, like me. And I will keep trying to be the best version of me. I am full of hope. I am what? Human. You are you, yes. Yes, Margaret, you are you, and I'm so glad you're here with us today.
I would climb the ladder because I have a bunch of wood dust to make a big slide.
You would, and you're very brave. I know this about you. So when we are trying to find our center, let's remember that it's not easy. It's not going to be easy as taking 3 licks on a lollipop and going crunch and get to that center, okay? Yep, there's going to be more stuff inside, and it's going to take a little bit longer, all right? Well, thank you for listening to my story. We're going to head off to the classroom now. I want to thank you all for listening to my story, too. Thank you. Ben, have a great service. So we're going to sing you out. So I know, Margaret, no, you can hang on to that. There's more. All right, so please help me sing the children off to class. You're going to put yours down? Okay, well, I'm going to take it with us because I haven't. Okay, help me sing these 4 wonderful children off to our classroom. You've got the light of love within you. Go on your way in peace. So let your light shine, the world awaits you. Oh, thank you. Go on your way in peace.
Benjamin Litchfield is a federal consumer financial protection lawyer practicing in Washington, D.C. at Buckley, LLP. Before entering private practice, Litchfield was a counsel at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he was responsible for developing the agency's national supervision strategy in the mortgage, credit card, automobile finance, and student loan markets. He's a graduate of George Washington University and the Howard University School of Law. In my short working with him, it's clear he's a very compassionate person and truly committed to addressing poverty with practical solutions. Thank you for being with us today.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. I want to start by thanking the fellowship for having me. I'm talking about the rather uplifting topic of poverty today, which I hope to spice it up with a few jokes along the way. So poverty is really, it's a complicated, multidisciplinary subject. It's very near and dear to my heart, having grown up myself in rural poverty, and it's also adjacent to a lot of what I do in my professional work. One of the first things that I did as a young intern at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, was work on economic inclusion in the unbanked or underbanked markets. Those are folks who don't have access to traditional bank accounts, and there are unique challenges for them. Then when I went on to the National Credit Union Administration, I worked on short-term lending, payday alternatives, and finding ways to bring folks into traditional financial services so they don't have to go to check cashing companies or payday lenders that charge them 360 to 1,000% interest. And so even in private practice, the work that I do with my clients, advising them on novel credit programs, ways to reach those folks, it's very near and dear and adjacent to my professional interests. Thinking about poverty, we can think about it through many different lenses. We can think about it in historical terms. What has the approach been to poverty? What does poverty look like throughout cultures and throughout time? We can think about it from an economic perspective, about the distribution of goods and services in the macroeconomy. We can think about it from a moral perspective. What do we owe each other and what do we owe our neighbors? closely related. We can think about it from a religious perspective as well. There is a strong tradition, I would argue, in Judeo-Christian and Muslim faith of looking out for the poor, protecting the poor. I think about Matthew and the parable of the sheep and the goats, what you do for the least of these. And so from a legal perspective, though, when we think about poverty, there are 4 major themes that we think about. We think about who qualifies for public assistance, what individuals under the laws should have access to public assistance, how is that assistance structured and limited. We think about what are the impacts on subgroups of the poor, particularly racial minorities, women, children, and should the law favor flexibility, or should it create formal rights? And throughout legal history, there's been this debate about whether folks who are poor are entitled to the benefits they receive, or whether they're merely an aspect of government largesse, just a benefit that we confer upon them that they don't really have an entitlement to. And often these themes relate to whether society views the people receiving the assistance as deserving or undeserving of such assistance. You'll often see debates politically and legally about the deserving or the undeserving poor. And that's particularly true in Anglo-American law, particularly in the United States. And so I want to start by taking a step back and thinking more on a macro level about what is poverty. And I have this quote from Molly Orshansky, who actually developed the US poverty line. And she says, "Poverty, like beauty, lies in the eye of the beholder. Poverty is a value judgment. It's not something that one can verify or demonstrate, except by inference and suggestion, even with a measure of error. To say who is poor is to use all sorts of value judgments. The concept has to be limited by the purpose which is to be served by the definition. There's no particular reason to count the poor unless you're going to do something about them. When it comes to defining poverty, you can only be more subjective or less so. You cannot be non-subjective." And I think this definitional question is really important because it helps frame how poverty is understood and the extent to which government policy should focus on poverty. For example, if we define poverty very narrowly, meaning that only a small population meets the definition of poverty, or what it means to be poor, poverty will appear minor. The impetus and the urgency with which to address poverty will not be existent, and it'll be difficult to talk to policymakers about anti-poverty programs if it appears that most people are not poor. On the other hand, though, if we have an overbroad definition of poverty and it appears that everybody is destitute, it dilutes the significance of poverty for those who are in extreme poverty. And so this definitional question is very important. Again, on a macro scale, there are competing ways to measure poverty and to think about it. We talk about poverty in absolute or relative terms. Absolute poverty refers to a lack of basic needs such as food, clothing, and shelter. And it's common to speak about poverty in absolute terms when we talk about developing nations. On the other hand, relative poverty looks to one's position in society, often as a percentage of mean income, and it examines questions such as income distribution and inequality. It's common in the United States and in other developed countries to talk about poverty in relative terms. We speak of relative deprivation, which refers to the absence or inadequacy of diets, amenities, standards, services, and activities which are common or customary in society. People, in other words, who are in relative poverty are denied the conditions of life which ordinarily define membership in society. And it's important to think about that because you could have, for example, a shack in the middle of the woods and have access to food, shelter, and modest clothing. So from an absolute poverty perspective, you are taken care of. You have the means with which to survive. But here in the United States, having a shack in the middle of the woods and some clothing, one would not be considered quite wealthy. In fact, that's the hallmark of quite a lot of poverty. There's not much that you can do in society with just those basic needs being met. And so it's more important when talking about poverty here, particularly in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Europe, to think about it in relative terms. What is the position of those that we consider to be poor vis-a-vis their friends and neighbors in society? There's a very good quote, people do not live by bread alone, and sometimes they're prepared to forego bread to meet a more pressing social need. And I think that goes to the core of what we mean by relative poverty, is that there are some things in society, in developed countries, that we think are just as important as food. Access to broadband internet, for example, a car, certain clothing items, a cell phone in some cases, because for many people, a cell phone is the only way in which someone accesses the internet or communicates throughout the world. So, so one thing that we need to consider when we think about relative poverty, particularly relative poverty in the United States, is whether things like cable television, which gives you access to the news, is a need. What about a computer and or internet access? How about a cell phone? Do people need a car not to be poor? And I think these questions, it's hard to answer them in the abstract. Maybe in Arlington, Virginia, you don't need a car to get around. There's adequate public services, there's the metro, there's metro buses. So to be poor in Arlington, Virginia doesn't necessarily include this question about whether you have a car. But if you get out into rural Virginia, out into the Southwest, out into the foothills of the Shenandoahs, not having access to a car means that you're essentially trapped in your home. And so is someone who lives in Shenandoah who doesn't have access to a car, are they considered poor? And those sorts of questions animate this discussion of relative poverty when we think about it in the United States. So poverty is laden with politics. I think that's very easy and very obvious to say. In the United States, poverty is measured primarily in two manners. The Department of Health and Human Services issues annual poverty guidelines that are used to determine eligibility for numerous federal and state programs. Those are based on family and household size. Those whose pre-tax income falls below these figures are considered poor. The HHS's poverty guidelines are not identical, but they're very similar to the Census Bureau's poverty thresholds. In fact, they're based on them. And these two measures serve different purposes, but often when we think about poverty, we're either thinking of the guidelines or the thresholds. The thresholds are prospective. They think forward. What does poverty look like in the next year? Who should be eligible for services in the next year? And so they are adjusted for inflation, whereas the annual poverty thresholds look at their retrospective. They look at the year past, who would be considered poor for the previous year. There are several federal programs offered by the Department of Agriculture, Energy, Labor, and Treasury, including Head Start, Medicare, Weatherization, and SNAP, where eligibility is based on some multiplier of these thresholds. However, the thresholds have been strongly criticized by advocacy groups as not adequately capturing need in the United States. There are alternatives like the self-sufficiency standard by the Center for Women's Welfare, the housing wage calculator by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, the family budget calculator by the Economic Policy Institute. It's important to remember that the policy thresholds were developed at a time when we didn't really have a measure for studying poverty. Molly Orshansky, who was an economist at the Social Security Administration, was looking to assess the relative risks of low economic status among different groups of families. And she used the USDA's food plan as a basis for developing the thresholds, but they were not developed based on a standard budget, so standards of minimum need, and they're not based on actual consumption behavior. And so that's another limitation of them. There have been a lot of recommendations to change the poverty thresholds, but they've been largely unsuccessful. The US poverty line is, for political purposes, rather fixed, and it's highly contentious when talking about changing it, because then you are either restricting the number of people who are deemed to be poor or you're expanding it, and from a political perspective, that's less desirable one way or the other. I won't belabor that point, but so here are just some criticisms of the current measure, and I know this is really dry, and I'm sorry about that. So the current poverty thresholds don't distinguish between the needs of workers and non-workers. So for example, the American family has changed significantly over time. More women are in the labor force today, although COVID had a significant negative effect on labor force participation for women. And so childcare is a real need for most families. However, the poverty thresholds don't take into account the cost of childcare. And so that's a significant negative factor in today's modern economy. It doesn't distinguish between differences in medical costs. And I see Dr. Brock in the audience. I guarantee that he could talk about that at length. Medical costs are not felt uniformly across different sections of poor folks, particularly when you talk about access to medical services and affordability. It is easier to find a doctor in some cases, although I defer to Dr. Brock, in much more urban settings, whereas in rural areas, it's much more difficult. Here in Virginia, for example, we have the remote area medical clinics, where the only time that folks out in the sticks will see a doctor is once a year when they set up a tent and they come to you. And so access to medical care, how much that actually costs, is a significant factor that's not considered when we talk about poverty thresholds. It also doesn't distinguish between different parts of the country, which is kind of what I was just alluding to, is that it is more expensive to live in cities and more expensive to live on the east and west coasts. I almost said left coast. But, it is a little bit cheaper to live in the heartland, and it doesn't distinguish between those two. And the family size adjustments that you make with the poverty limit are anomalous. They don't reflect the modern family, the reduction in the number of children in the average household. There's no real method to that. And more broadly, they don't reflect changes in the standard of living. We have, in the United States, been very blessed to have a high standard of living that has increased as we have become a more advanced economy. But the poverty thresholds don't actually capture that. In fact, if the thresholds were adjusted to reflect the higher standard of living, you'd find more people in poverty today than what the thresholds suggest. I mean, think about what we were talking about with access to cable television. If we define the bundle of needs to include cable, cell phone service, access to reliable broadband, things like that, more people would be deemed to be in poverty today than what the government suggests. And so social scientists have suggested new factors, including based on budgets that include food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and other needs, and more importantly, actual consumer data, the way that people actually shop, contingencies on family size and net income, to try to develop this minimum adequate standard of living. That has gone, to be quite honest, that's gone nowhere. Politicians have no interest in adjusting these poverty guidelines just because you get into very fraught debates about what it means, like I was saying, to be poor or to not be poor, what that says about society, what it says about the expansion of government programs, and so it's fraught with politics. Philosopher Amartya Sen, just to throw it out there a little bit and take a detour, has suggested that we think about poverty not necessarily in terms of relative or absolute poverty or in terms of providing a minimum adequate standard of living, but we think about poverty in terms of creating capabilities. Sen's approach to poverty is about thinking about poverty in terms of personal heterogeneities, the individual factors, diversities in the physical environment, variations in social climate, and differences in relational perspectives, the things that keep us from being fully functioning members of society. Thinking about poverty in terms of what does poverty feel like to those who have a physical disability? What does poverty feel like to those who live in a climate that is racked with climate change? What does the social safety net offer for those who live in a society? And what does the community expect an ordinary citizen to have or to do? Thinking about our approach to poverty as creating capabilities so that individuals can participate on an equal footing with those who don't have physical disabilities, participate on an equal footing with those who don't have environments racked with climate change, participate on an equal footing with those who have a robust social safety net. It's a different way of thinking about poverty, and I think that it's kind of something that we can pause on and reflect and even apply here in the United States. It's very popular in Europe, and it's reflected in the United Nations reports on poverty. The way that the Europeans think about poverty is about, like I said, creating these capabilities, creating a situation where someone can be an ordinary member of society and can do the things that one would expect. The focus is much more on uplifting and empowering individuals as opposed to merely maintaining them and keeping them alive. There's a lot more dignity in the capability approach, and that's why it's favored by some moral philosophers like Amartya Sen. It's not necessarily favored by policymakers because it's more expensive, but, well, I'll leave that there. And so now that I've talked about poverty broadly and in the abstract sense, I've talked about how it's measured, what it means, how we address poverty in the United States a little bit. I'd like to talk specifically about poverty in the United States and give you some statistics that I think are pretty helpful. 11.6%, or 37.9 million people, are currently living in poverty. And that includes 16.9%, or 12.2 million children. And that's more likely to be episodic, periodic poverty for children, or 10.3 or 5.7 million seniors. A third of women-led households live in poverty, and this number is even higher for households led by women of color. And poverty is tolerated more in the United States than in other countries. I think that if you do a comparative approach between the United States and Europe, you'll see that our policies are far less generous towards the poor and the needy than our European counterparts. Just to give you some historical perspective, poverty hasn't changed much in the history of the United States. I know that historians and politicians like to talk about this myth of the successful American pioneer, the myth of the American colonist, but actual facts reflect that early colonists were largely of middling income or poor, and the indigent included, and this may sound common to many of you, mothers who had been abandoned or widowed, the sick, the disabled, the elderly, and the mentally ill. So as far as the composition of who is poor and what poverty looks like, it hasn't changed much over time. What has changed, though, is income inequality. Though it's important to note that poverty and inequality are not the same thing, they're often correlated. High income inequality is an indicator of greater poverty. And in the United States, productivity outpaces the median family income. We have a tremendous gap between productivity and income. The top 5% of earners continue to see real income growth, while the bottom 25% make about the same in real terms as they did in 1973. And what I mean by real terms is that when you adjust their income for inflation, they're making about the same as they did in 1973. However, the top 5% are making significantly more. And then it gets the income inequality becomes even starker once you subdivide the top 5% into the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%. The numbers are pretty stark. Now, some will say, well, you know, people in America aren't really very poor. They have access to Xboxes. If you go into a trailer park in Spotsylvania County, you'll see houses with Xboxes and big screen TVs and nice cars in the driveway. And what I would invite you to think about, though, is what we've been talking about with relative poverty. Is an Xbox an indicator of economic wealth in a nation where we have folks who can buy whole social media companies with the stroke of a check? Is it an indicator of wealth if if the only thing that they buy is a big screen television to entertain themselves when they have no other means to participate in society? They don't have access to a car, they don't have access to finer clothing, they don't go to fine dining. It's really an open question, but there is this sort of counter argument from particularly social conservatives that there is no poverty in the United States, that there are food banks and all sorts of supports, and that there are the means with which to survive and to provide for yourself, and it's more of an absolutist thinking. And some have argued that when we think about poverty, what we should really be talking about is economic mobility. Rather than focusing on poverty itself, we should be focusing on whether individuals have the means with which to uplift themselves and to move through economic strata. That, I would argue, though, necessarily involves a consideration of things like the legacy of chattel slavery, Jim Crow discrimination, and the presence of structural racism. It's very hard to say that we are an economically mobile society when there's appraiser bias. One of the largest ways to build wealth in the United States is still to own a home. But when you are a black person selling a home, your house is typically appraised at less than what it is for a comparable white family. And we've seen that just recently. The New York Times covered this a black professor had his house in New York City appraised for half the price of what it was appraised when they took his pictures down and put the pictures of a white family in there. And so when we have these structural biases, when we have credit discrimination, when we have all these other factors, the question becomes, well, yes, we can focus on economic mobility, great, but we also have to address the factors that make it so that certain subsets of the poor are not as economically mobile as others. So again, though, when you talk about economic mobility, you also bring up this idea of the deserving and the undeserving poor. In society, we expect the poor to make some effort at self-sufficiency, and our policy approach has largely been to help those making the effort while punishing in one form or another those who don't. And there are real academic questions about whether the government action can improve economic structure. You have the classical libertarian argument that the government doesn't help and that we should let the invisible hand sort this all out and that government policies hinder rather than help. And on the other side, you have the progressive argument that government policy can restructure the economy in such a way that it's fair. Just to give you some perspective, according to empirical studies, economic mobility has not increased enough to offset income inequality. We are much further apart from each other on an economic perspective, but no more likely to span the increased distances. So we're talking about intergenerational mobility. Just to give you an example, it would take a poor family of 4 with 2 children 9 to 10 generations or 200 years to achieve a middle-class income. We are more unequal and less mobile in society today. And I want to switch gears and then I'll wrap up, just to give you sort of an overview of how poverty has been developed in the United States. So poverty relief is, as I've mentioned, less comprehensive and less generous than most developed democracies. The laws in poverty relief governing the early colonies were based on notions of deserving and undeserving poor that were originally developed in the Middle Ages to address labor shortages and destitution in England. Poverty relief was also conducted largely at the state and local level. Just to give you some examples, because I know I've been droning on, the first poverty relief laws in Anglo-American tradition are the English Poor Laws, which dealt with labor shortages in the 1300s. They forced the non-working poor to labor at legally mandated maximum wages. They prohibited begging and giving of alms, and prison was what happened to anybody who disobeyed. So I'm not going to go through each of these laws, but the Anglo-American tradition has largely been to punish the non-working poor, to give very minimal benefits, and to mandate maximum wages. Over time, though, we've seen a more charitable approach to those who are deemed deserving, to widows, to those who are in old age, to those who are sick. However, not very much. Just to give you some examples, the Act for Relief of the Poor, which was passed by Parliament, apprenticed out children as old as 1 year old. The 1535 statute forced work for anyone over 5 years. And again, anyone who refused to work was led to jail or indentured service. In the colonies, what we see is largely this tradition of deserving versus undeserving poor carries over. Obviously, we have the Bill of Rights, and we have certain protections in life, liberty, and property, so that we can't be forced to work. We can't be, you certainly can't take children and put them in apprenticeships, but what you see is the development of poorhouses that were socially punitive and morally corrective. Poverty was seen as a moral fault in the colonies. Later in the 18th century, you see the rise of workhouses where the working poor were housed together. The poorhouses sorted worthy versus unworthy workers. They had very rigid schedules. They taught habits of industry. It's very Calvinist in its approach. Almshouses had punitive regulations to dissuade people from using them, and most poorhouses did not work as intended, and so poor people tended to be auctioned off to houses that needed labor. You see these themes throughout early American history that the poor were morally judged despite their economic conditions. The racial disparities were incredibly stark. The outcomes for families of color was very different than the outcomes for white families. And there's a lot of symbolic politics. You see politicians talking about being tough on the poor, those poor rakes, we're going to hold them accountable, no beggars on the doles, things like that. There's a lot of symbolic politics that you even see today in Congress. The progressive era was somewhat different. Europe was starting to establish social insurance and other types of public assistance. And the United States had limited measures that were largely focused on fatherless children and widows. 46 states enacted laws to protect widows. These widow pensions actually formed the basis for Social Security. In the 1920s, more than 40 states enacted worker compensation programs, but not unemployment insurance. And welfare was largely a matter of private charity during the progressive era. Public assistance was abolished, which really caused a problem when the Great Depression happened. The New Deal, in the New Deal era, the dismantling of public assistance made society very vulnerable. The lack of services made it impossible to stay the economic downturn. And so what you see in the New Deal was work relief, unemployment insurance, Social Security, grant and aid programs. But the New Deal program was not shared by all. The economic prosperity of the 40s and 50s largely fell on white middle-class families. Communities of color didn't experience the same kind of prosperity. Rural and urban poor were not able to take advantages. For example, the Social Security Act gave too much deference to the states. And so as you can imagine, during the Jim Crow era, not many of the benefits flowed to communities of color. Working programs like the Work Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps were short-lived, and the GI Bill did not reach rural and urban poor. You see this as part of the Great Society. You see this real focus on bringing low-income rural and urban communities in the economic mainstream with VISTA, Peace Corps, Head Start. Sorry, the Johnson administration did a lot. So I'm trying to summarize. Food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, federal education funding for elementary, secondary, and college education. And then after the Great Society, you see this critique, this retrenchment and welfare reform. And I want to read you a quote from Ronald Reagan because I think it's particularly heinous, but it kind of captures what people were thinking at the time. She has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards, and is collecting veterans benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. And she's collecting Social Security on her cards. She's got Medicaid, getting food stamps, and she's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. That was Reagan's definition of a welfare queen, which is laden with racial overtones and absolutely ridiculous. But Reagan's criticism kind of took hold, and you see in the 70s, 80s, and 90s this effort, this sustained effort to chip away at the social safety net, to chip away at anti-poverty programs that culminated in the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of '96 during the Clinton administration. And what that did was it, as Clinton said, ended welfare as we know it. It created a series of means tests. It made it much more difficult to access public services. And I want to contrast and it really reflects a shift in our approach in the United States towards poverty from creating opportunity, which was largely a capability approach, to maintain it to a maintenance-oriented society. Poverty is just something that we're going to have to deal with. It's something that we have to live with. So let's give them what they need so that they can go off and be away from us and we can enjoy this economic prosperity. That's largely the message that was carried, that we must, at our sufferance, maintain the poor. And so you see that strategy carried out largely to the modern day. When we talk about the poor, it's not about creating opportunities for the poor, it's about controlling negative externalities, negative consequences of poverty, just maintaining them at sufferance. And so it's a very different approach, it's a very different mindset, and it actually created real vulnerabilities during the Great Recession. Because what we saw during the Great Recession, and I became a lawyer and started practicing right as the recession was really hitting in 11 and 12, was that despite having programs to help the needy, they were structured in such a way that those families who are displaced as a result of the mortgage meltdown actually didn't qualify and didn't get to take advantage of them. And so it begs the question about whether our current approach towards poverty, whether our current thinking about poverty is actually working and whether it makes a resilient, inclusive economy that's able to weather these storms. I think that you can see when I was at the CFPB during the pandemic, you could also see this. There were a lot of people who needed help. And the programs that worked best were the programs that gave help regardless of perceived need. It stemmed the bleeding, so to speak. But but the programs that offered means testing, the programs that were designed to keep people off of the public dole as opposed to help them through a temporary hardship, those programs didn't work as well during the pandemic. And so it really does, as we think about poverty and as we go forward in 2023 in thinking about poverty and how to address poverty, it does raise this question about whether we should be creating capabilities, whether we should be lifting the least of these as Matthew instructs, or whether we should be maintaining them at sufferance. And it's a hotly contested aspect of poverty law. It's a hotly contested aspect of poverty policy. And so I wanted to go lastly before wrapping up, but I think I've droned on for too long. That's a yes. I wanted to talk about different poverty programs, but I think that I'm just going to talk about one in particular where I think that our efforts have been particularly disastrous, and that's education. So the federal student loan program, well, I'll go back. Originally thought of, our approach to education was about lifting people up. We had the Perkins Grant, we had all sorts of grants, we had need-based aid. It wasn't largely about student loans. There wasn't much financialization to it. As we see a shift from the Great Society, which was largely giving money to people, and through grants, to a more maintenance-oriented mindset, you see the creation of the student loan program. The student loan program, at its worst, has created what I would call an ATM without any guardrails. You allow 18-year-old poor kids who have very little financial literacy to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars at 6 to 10% interest to go try to achieve an education that once they have it, they cannot benefit from it because their student loan payments are eating up all of their income. Think about, for example, teachers. If you're a poor person and you want to be a teacher because, say, your teachers were your greatest mentors, and so you're like, I want to be a teacher. I want to be just like, I don't know, my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Hanlon, or someone like that. You have to go to school for that. You have to get a master's degree. You're tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and you're making a student loan payment that probably eats up your entire teacher salary. You're able to, it begs the question of, has the program achieved its desired effect? Has it lifted people out of poverty? Has it provided the kind of benefits that we think it has? And it really hasn't. And so our approach to education, I think, has largely been wrong-headed. And I think it's been based on a lack of desire to actually uplift people and more to appear like we're doing so. But that's my editorializing. But I did just want to talk about that because student loans, second from credit card and mortgage debt, are some of the largest payments that consumers make every day. And the stories that I saw in the federal government were really tragic. They were people who, based on a hope and a dream, went and tried to better themselves, and they were cheated along the way by for-profit education institutions, and they were left with hundreds of thousands of debt and holding the bag. And our collective response was, too bad, so sad. You knew what you were doing at 18 years old when you took on hundreds of thousands of debt to go get an education that was relatively worthless. And so I did just want to highlight education as an area where I think in terms of poor policy, we're not doing a very good job. So the last piece of this, and I have droned on, is really about where I think we can go and giving hope for the future, because it is 2023, it is New Year's. I think that what we can do and why I focus so much on the history is because we've seen programs that work. The Great Society, although it had many drawbacks, worked. It uplifted people out of poverty, it provided opportunities, it was intended to be a government guarantee, not a guaranteed job or a guaranteed income, but a guaranteed shot at a fair way of living. It created things like Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid. It created the Perkins grants. And it provides a real venue, a real method through which we can address poverty if we go back to it, if we commit ourselves to providing a hand up rather than just providing maintenance. If we view poverty not as a personal failure, but as an economic failure, as the failure of our economy to provide someone the means with which to sustain themselves, to build their own life. If we look at poverty from an economic mobility perspective, creating those capabilities. And so I think we have tremendous opportunity. We have opportunity particularly in terms of early childhood education. There was a Virginia senator who's now running for Congress who had a great early childhood education plan that would have lifted millions and millions of families out of poverty, supporting things like that, and supporting the folks in our community who are doing the work. We have tremendous anti-poverty efforts here in Fredericksburg. We have the food bank, we have Stafford Serve, we have the Moss Clinic, we have all sorts of things. Volunteering, giving them money, supporting them also can create more opportunities. And so, sorry, I've gone on too long. With that, I will stop. I will just stop speaking. Yeah.
So I'm hoping you would be willing to stay a little after the service if people have specific questions.
Yeah, sure. I know that I probably went way over time, so I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really like the frame of poverty as an economic failure, not a moral failure, not a, I mean, I think that's something that, kind of a nice frame for it. So thank you very much. I can think about it differently. Okay, offertory. So during the offertory, you're invited to come forward and silently place a pebble, we'll get it, in the bowl of water for any joys and concerns you're holding in your heart. The ministries of this fellowship continue to wholly depend on the generosity of spirit from our friends and members. If you're online, we encourage you to donate via text message or by visiting our website and using the online form on our home page. We'll post the text number and link in the chat and on the screen. Greeters will be coming around with a basket for in-person donations. Thanks, Madison. May all that has been shared and freely given here help us grow in generosity and caring for the world of which we are a part. So, joys and concerns? Great, thanks, Paula.
Good morning. They made this just for me, can you tell? I am Paula Barnes. I'm a member of the pastoral care team. You can also refer me as to her or she. And as a caring community, we share personal matters that we want our community to hold in our hearts. I have no written joys or concerns, but I certainly want to lift up everyone in Ukraine. I know that's all around us, and keep them in our thoughts and prayers and heart. And joy, I'm getting my one knee replaced in March, so that's a joy for me. Let's take a few moments just to silently acknowledge the concerns and joys that have not been spoken.
Our closing words are by Jane Taylor, who also wrote Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, just in case you know. I saw an old cottage of clay, and only of mud was the floor. It was all falling into decay, and the snow drifted in at the door. Yet there a poor family dwelt, in a hovel so dismal and rude, and though gnawing hunger they felt, they had not a morsel of food. The children were crying for bread, and to their poor mother they'd run. "Oh, give us some breakfast," they said. Alas, their poor mother had none. She viewed them with looks of despair. She said, and I'm sure it was true, "'Tis not for myself that I care, but my poor little children for you. Oh, then let the wealthy and gay," us, "but see such a hovel as this, that in a poor cottage of clay they may know what true misery is. And what I may have to bestow, I will never squander away, while many poor people I know around me are wretched as they." Please join me in reading in unison our words for extinguishing the chalice, found on the screen. We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of love and service. May it be a catalyst for spiritual growth and social justice, as we carry it outside these walls to the world we live in, until we are together again. Go in peace.